Hello,
Alicea.
how are you? So is there, we want to start with updates or?
I'll have more to say a little bit later. I'm finishing up some things and getting settled.
Ashu, do you have, I know you were working on something last week. Did you have anything this week?
Yeah, so I have shared the updated GitHub repository and I will be continue to work on it.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you.
Welcome, sir.
It's like Morgan and Barshan have joined us.
Good morning.
Morning.
It's a cold day here in San Francisco.
Okay.
It's a typical summer day for San Francisco.
Yeah. Barshan, how are you?
Yeah. For this week, actually, I was working on some test scripts so that like some of them were like knowing if the whole forward bias thing works and the training part. So I put up a pull request giving that training script. So it's a kind of a mock training script, which takes only like 3-4 embryos together to check if the whole forward loop works or the neural network works with all the modules together. So so that training script went in, like it passed successfully all the tests. So now I have a few more training scripts. I was thinking if I should upload those as well, but those won't really affect the rest of the actual files, source files. Those are mostly like demo files. So I can upload those as well, but it might crowd up the repo. That's the thing. So
What do you mean crowd the repo?
those are like just demo files. Those weren't like those don't have a purpose to the final thing. Like it's just for
Okay.
checking all this, like all the model is running fine or not. That's it.
Okay.
So for the final output, it will be a different script. Like this training script, I'll be editing like all the configs, so like the learning rate and stuff. So I have the config ready, like the weight decay and the window size and whatever, the stride, whatever I'll be putting. So those are ready. And so I might also put up the demo scripts as well.
Yeah, so here's the pull request. So this is Barshan's pull request to add test training script. This is only a smoke test. The smoke test is a term from software development lifecycle where you just do something to see if it works. The goal is to confirm that training runs end to end without errors, to measure performance. So you had train sgel.py, which is the just has the code in it. View file here, and this just is the code for this. So it's importing the data sets and it's checking to see if it works. That looks good.
Yeah. For now, it's just training one epoch and like one whole cycle, and I think the evaluations came around 0.7 or 0.5. So it's like 50% prediction, of course. So yeah, so it's like a basic, like after one epoch, that's how it should be, like 0.5. It didn't really be biased.
Yes, looks good. So yeah. Thank you, Barshan. Do you have a blog post for this week or?
Yeah, I'll be presenting that on Monday.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
Another thing that's happened in DevoGraph this week is that Jayadratha Gayan, who worked on DevoTG, and this was last year, he finally got his paper out on the archive. So this was a paper that he derived from his GSoC work. So this is describing that work. This is DevoTG, temporal graph neural networks for modeling C. elegans developmental connectomics. So he was working on these temporal graphs. This is the Whitvleet data set. This is kind of benchmarking that data set on this method. And so he's using these discrete time dynamic graphs for the developing synaptic connectome. It has his findings here, and he also has the code at the repository. So this is a nice accomplishment. We've been discussing this in DevoWorm for a while, and it's nice to see this out. So there's some documentation in the repo if you're interested in going back and looking at what he has here. he has the data and the notebooks and the outputs and the scripts. So this is basically describes what's here. Well, congratulations to Jayadratha for that. Okay, why don't I get into my open source feature first? What I want to talk about today are two articles by Bradley Kuhn from the Software Freedom Conservancy. This is the Conservancy blog. The first one is, this is from 2022, so this is a little bit perhaps dated, but it'll be interesting to see kind of what they have to say and how that relates to what's going on today. So the title of this is If Software is My Copilot, Who Programmed My Software? So this is thinking about open source, and in this case, Microsoft's Copilot, and how that kind of works together. So we start with software freedom as our goal. Copyleft is a strategy to reach that goal. So copyleft, of course, is the sort of philosophy behind the open source licenses that we use today. So the MIT license, or some other license like Apache or something like that. Also, if you use Creative Commons licenses, that's also something called the philosophy behind that is called copyleft. And copyleft is the opposite of copyright. So copyright is where you put a mark on something and you protect the intellectual property of that thing. And it's explicitly against making copies of something or utilizing something for purposes of remixing it or something like that. Copyleft actually takes a different approach. And copyleft stresses the notion of sort of the basic product, the basic framework of the product, and encourages people to remix the work for their own use, and encourages sort of people who adopt these licenses to build on sort of a base license. So for example, you might have a Creative Commons license that's very basic in saying this work, you have to do certain things if you adopt this work to satisfy the requirements of the license. And so those things might be, you can't use it for commercial purposes, you can't use it for other types of purposes. You must attribute the people who created the work, and these sorts of things. So it basically gives the sort of the person who created the content or the software freedom to say what people can and can't use the work for. So this is the idea here is that you have software freedom. And last week we talked about free software, or the Free Software Foundation. And when they say free software, this is what they mean. They mean software freedom, the freedom to use software, or the freedom to sort of manage the intellectual property of that software in a way that doesn't get in the way of the open source productivity model. So this is a statement right out of the box that this is our goal, to have software freedom in the form of copyleft licensing and that sort of governance. That tenet is often forgotten by activists. Copyleft is even abused to advance proprietary goals. We too often see concern about this future of copyleft overshadow the necessary fundamental question. Does a particular behavior or trend, and the inevitable outcomes of those behaviors and trends, increase or decrease users' rights to copy, share, modify, and reinstall modified versions of their software? That question remains paramount as we face new challenges. So this is interesting. Copyleft is even abused to advance proprietary goals. So copyleft allows great freedom to the end user of some product to modify the product or to use it as they see fit. And so sometimes, corporations or entities will try to use open source products and sort of enclose it in a proprietary way. Or sometimes there will be a mix of copyleft licensing and then proprietary organizational goals. And so these are kinds of, this is something that needs to be balanced out. And, sometimes this comes into conflict where, maybe one project that's a fork wants to do something that's proprietary and the main project does not, or it could be the other way around. And so that comes into conflict more often than we'd like. So, introduced first by Microsoft's GitHub in their Copilot product, computer-assisted software authorship by way of machine learning models presents a formidable challenge to software freedom's future. So we talked about how this, presents a challenge to maintainers, it presents a challenge to organizations, but it does present a challenge to the whole open source productivity model. And, there are different ways in which these challenges happen, but basically, we have large corporations with these models, and then people use the models in like say an open source context, and especially now that we have this intersection of Copilot and GitHub, where we might host our work on GitHub, and Copilot is sort of integrated into that, and there's this imperative by Microsoft to sort of fully integrate GitHub with the sorts of activities that involves Copilot. So using repositories as training data, and then integrating Copilot in a way that doesn't necessarily match the terms and conditions of a copyleft license. Yet we can in fact imagine a software freedom utopia that embodies this technology. So we talked about open source models last week, and that might be one possibility, but they're kind of going in a different direction here. Imagine that all software authors have access to the global archive of machine learning models, and that they are fully reproducible. So this is a sort of a hypothetical situation. Everyone has equal rights to fork those models and train them further with their own data sets, provided that they must release new models and input code freely into the global archive. All code produced by these models is also made freely available under copyleft. All code that builds the models, all historical input sets, and all trained models are also made available to everyone under copyleft licenses. So this is the sort of the copyleft vision of using AI models and how that would fit directly in to the vision of software freedom and open source. Now we talked about open source models, and of course, those kind of conform to this vision. But then, of course, you have proprietary models, and it's a very different imperative. So, there is this tension there. And, the question is, there are a lot of questions here. The first is, could you have data sets that are fully open source? That is, could you derive your own data set where, there are no sort of connections to anyone else's intellectual property rights, or, there's you can do this at scale in a way that is viable as an open source thing. And so this is where, we kind of get into this realm of, perhaps, large AI models require proprietary organization to implement and to distribute them. But, as we've seen with some of these open source large language models, perhaps not. Perhaps we can do this in sort of the way that, more in the way of this vision. While activists might quibble about minor details to optimize imagined utopia, this thought experiment shows computer-assisted software authorship does not inherently negate software freedom. Rather, the rules, requirements, and policies that apply will determine whether software freedom is respected. To paraphrase Hamlet, there's nothing either good or bad, but the policy makes it so. So, according to this vision, this is, the idea is basically the policy or the governance of the organization is going to make a difference. Okay, so then this next section, obviously ignoring machine learning for computer-assisted software authorship will not usher in the software freedom utopia. Copyleft activists cannot stand idly by in this situation, but we must temper our attention by considering the likelihood of dystopian and problematic outcomes and the options available to prevent them. In response to Copilot's announcement, pundits speculated without evidence. A prevailing feeling of free software had a good run, but I guess that's over now. Such predictions seem consistent with the well-documented over-optimism of artificial intelligence's success. The rapid replacement of traditional software development methodologies seem unlikely, however. As such, we should not overestimate the likelihood that these new systems will both accelerate proprietary software development, while we simultaneously fail to prevent copylefted software from enabling that activity. The former may not come to pass, so we should not unduly fret about the latter, lest we misdirect resources. In short, AI is usually slow-moving and produces incremental change far more often than it produces radical change. The problem is thus not imminent, nor the damage irreversible. However, we must respond deliberately with all due celerity and begin that work immediately. So basically, this is an interesting part here. We should not overestimate the likelihood that these new systems will both accelerate proprietary software development while simultaneously failing to prevent copylefted software from enabling that activity. So that's a little confusing to me. I don't know why, but it's basically the idea that proprietary software development will come at the expense of open source development for reasons involving the proprietary nature of very large language models. And of course, we had this conversation last week about how there are open source models that are closing the gap. But I think this characterizes, especially back in 2022, this sort of, how people were feeling about this, and how people were thinking about, this phenomena as a threat to open source development. On the other hand, this person, the author, points out that these changes that you'll see in productivity and in the mode of production of software is not likely to be changed very radically. It's likely to be changed incrementally, or things will balance themselves out. So this is a little bit more about some of these things going on. And so this was all based on when Copilot announced that they would be become integrated with GitHub. So this is the whole sort of context behind this article. So it points out here, currently there are two factors that influence the timing of our response. So the first is that if GitHub's Copilot becomes a non-beta product available to the programming public, that would indicate necessity of an urgent response. Microsoft and GitHub are unlikely to share their product plans, so we cannot know for sure when this will occur. However, in the 7 months since the first beta was made available, we consistently heard anecdotally that more and more developers, particularly FOSS developers, had received beta invitations. Based on these facts, we must assume that a move from private beta to public deployment is imminent in 2022. So they view this as sort of an urgent problem. And of course, it's already happened to us now. So, Second, we already know that some of our worst fears are definitely true. Namely, that Microsoft and GitHub use copylefted software as part of Copilot's training set. So this was part of the angst here, is that they're using copylefted software as sort of in the training set of Copilot, and then Copilot would turn around and author software that would then not be copyleft. Copilot was trained on billions of lines of public code written by others. While GitHub has refused requests to release even a list of repositories included in the training set, use of the word public indicates that only software with source available licenses, even if not FOSS licenses, were inputted into Copilot. Furthermore, GitHub admits that during training, the system encountered a copy of the GPL more than 700,000 times. This effectively confirms that copylefted public code appears in the training set. So this is interesting. And so the secrecy and non-cooperativeness is expected from a proprietary software company. It's a subsidiary, but leaves us only with speculative conclusions to inform a strategy for copyleft here. We can reliably guess that the companies will claim fair use as their primary justification for creating the model and offering the service, and will argue that both the output and trained model are not works based on the program, which is GPL version 2, nor do they copy from or adapt all or part of the works in a fashion requiring copyright permission, which is GPL version 3. So these are like excerpts from the GPL license and how, you know, a large proprietary corporation is kind of arguing its way around it. Furthermore, we can reliably conclude, given the continuing product promotion, that the companies have at least a medium-term commitment to Copilot. So this gets into this issue of, you know, training a model on things that have copyright protections or sometimes copyleft protections. So we are, I think, more familiar with the copyright case, where, you know, you might have something that is like a work that was a book at some point, and, you know, it's been used, it's been maybe accessed by the model and included into the training set. And then the idea is that the book is usually sold and the royalties go to the author. And in this case, none of that is the case. And in any case, you know, using some book or something like that in this way creates a situation where it goes outside the conventional royalty scheme. So, you know, there's some violation of the copyright law there. With copyleft, it's a little harder to understand what the remedy is there, because you're obviously violating, or maybe not obviously, violating the terms of the copyleft license, but it's not quite clear what the remedy is. So this is kind of what the angst is in this article, and they kind of go through and talk a little bit about it, and, you know, thinking exactly about what the responsibility of someone is who uses, say, a repository to train their model with. What should, you know, do they need to follow the letter of the law in terms of the copyleft license, or is there some sort of ambiguity there? And, you know, maybe we need to change our copyleft licensing strategy a bit. But, you know, this is the thing. So there's this part here: Copilot leaves copyleft compliance as an exercise for the user, which is, of course, not necessarily a legally sound strategy. Users likely face growing liability that only increases as Copilot improves. Users currently have no methods besides serendipity and educated guesses to know whether Copilot's output is copyrighted by someone else or copylefted by someone else. Proprietary software companies such as Synopsys provide so-called scanning tools that can search your proprietary code base and find hidden copylefted software. So, you know, there are ways to sort of find that, the source of the code, and, you know, attribute it properly. However, the FOSS tools for that job are in their infancy and unlikely to develop quickly, since historically those who want those tools are companies that primarily develop proprietary software and seek to avoid copylefted software. So this is just kind of their perspective here is to simply avoid Copilot to get around these potential infringements. So that's one article I wanted to cover, and hopefully we can talk about it a little bit later here. This next article is from the same blog, and this is recommendations when using large language model-backed generative AI systems for FOSS contributions. So this is, I'm not sure what the date is on this, but this is just kind of a set of recommendations that they've published. So this is post that article, at least 2024, because they mention here in 2024. Actually, they mentioned the original article here. So this is kind of following up on this. And these are the recommendations. And this is, again, the Software Freedom Conservancy. So it's some sort of special interest organization that's advocating for software freedom. So the entire community of computer users, which quickly approaches every human, faces the growing conundrum of generative artificial intelligence systems backed by large language models. Software freedom activists face particularly difficult challenges in this regard. These large language model Gen AI systems have been applied in earnest to the endeavors of software creation and modification. We cannot sufficiently mitigate this tricky problem with merely one statement or a few blog posts. So in 2022, this article that we just covered was published. In the last year, that journey grew into complexity and urgency when some of SFC's member projects and supporters began to regularly request moral and ethical guidance on these matters. SFE spent these months in almost daily internal discussions about the plethora of dilemmas presented by LLM generative AI systems. Now in 2024, SFC published an aspirational statement, which is here. This is an aspirational statement on large language model generative AI programming, which was actually more of a thought experiment rather than a definition. So this is more of a definition. This article here, this article links to, is more of the aspiration. So we now make urgent recommendations to those ordered by their employees to use large language models, generative AI code assistants, to contribute to free and open source software. Of course, that doesn't mean that you're forced to do it, but there is this, there is this conundrum that people want guidance on. Some FOSS project leaders have taken a zero-tolerance approach to any kind of AI contributions to their projects. We support leaders who make such decisions. FOSS project leaders deserve our sympathy and understanding regarding the voluminous onslaught of new contributions. Patch evaluation has always required careful analysis because humans can write bad code, machines can write bad code, and you need to be able to have these checks in the pull request acceptance process. Now, that analysis demand reasonably feels daunting to maintainers, and everyone should respect their decision. Nevertheless, we cannot and must not ignore the many FOSS contributors who decide to explore these tools for the betterment of FOSS. Software freedom activism only succeeds when we admit that we are at least decades away from universal software freedom. Proprietary systems will continue to exist, and there is a real danger they will continue to leapfrog FOSS. We should resist the use of proprietary systems, which include the most popular large language model AI systems, but we should also remain willing, as we always have, to utilize such systems when they can advance software freedom. And so this is just kind of getting into what they recommend. So they have 14 recommendations. So I'll just go through these quickly, and then we can have a discussion about this. So the most important ones are first, and then they go down in terms of priority. So the first is the FOSS community should support, not just tolerate, those who outright reject large language model AI systems. Okay, so that's like, it's kind of like a religious exemption almost, where, people have their reasons for not using it, and you shouldn't force people to use something. I don't know in the FOSS community if that's a common practice. It seems more common in the corporate world. But in any case, that's number one. Number two is every FOSS contributor deserves self-determination regarding large language model AI. So no one should be required to use those systems under duress. So the first two recommendations are about sort of forced use or compulsory use. Number three is that FOSS projects should not shun contributors who choose to use large language model AI systems. So they should be kind of treated in the same way, and they should be given equal consideration. Such contributions should be treated no differently than a technically inadequate first patch. Some submitters should be welcomed to the community and receive a gentle, albeit perhaps firm language response, thanking them for their interest and explaining gently why the project will not accept their contribution. So I don't know, I guess there's a bias there, although you're not supposed to shun contributors. In any case, before submission, FOSS contributors must invest substantial time reviewing AI-assisted and or generated contributions. So this means that the contributions need curation, and contributors should acquire an in-depth understanding of their contribution. Being able to engage with human contributors and humans, kind of understanding what a model is providing in terms of insight or in terms of code is essential. Number 5, full disclosure on how and when large language models, generative AI systems were utilized to assist in the creation of a contribution is a moral imperative. So this is again with transparency and sort of interpretability. Number 6, contributors should only submit unattended AI contributions in an area explicitly designated for such. If none exists, such contributions should be assumed unwelcome. So I don't know what they mean by unattended. I guess that's where they don't want to waste too much of the maintainer's time in these kinds of projects and going over these kinds of pull requests. Maintainer's time is precious and is best used in human-to-human interactions with new and existing human contributors. Maintainers should think carefully about the types of unintended large language model AI contributions that may be useful. We encourage project leaders to flexibly and regularly, but also slowly and deliberately, consider policy changes on unattended contributions when new contributors present new ideas. Number 7, generative AI users should keep detailed and accurate records of their interaction and save those meta artifacts for posterity, so like logs, prompts, and notes. 8 is avoid jumping to conclusions about the legal significance of generated contributions, whether they are copyright washing machines that ruin copyleft. That's interesting. This means that you don't want to have a bunch of copyrighted material in the model that then creates code that you commit to a repository that's licensed in a copyleft way. So it's just kind of separating out the copyright from the copyleft. And now everything, because of the technology you're using to generate code, everything gets swept up and dumped into the copyleft ecosystem. It's an interesting point, and I don't know what the answer is there, or even if that's really a valid concern, but we can talk about that. Number 9, inputs impact the licensing of the artifacts. So again, when you have an input that's maybe copyrighted, can you even accept it into a copyleft environment? Number 10 is copyleft everything remains the best viable and safest approach. So everything should be copyleft. So there shouldn't be any sort of, mixing of code, but also that everything in a repository should be licensed as copyleft. So we can't have, contributions to a project that is licensed under copyleft to be sort of copyright. So everything has to be copyleft, and everything also has to conform to that license. So this is, just a licensing issue, but it's important, I think, because a lot of times, we're not aware of how what we create interacts with the governance and the licensing strategies that our organizations use. And so they're very much against proprietary tools. They don't recommend them, but sometimes you have to use proprietary tools. And so that leads us to number 11, when AI systems, including proprietary ones, can massively accelerate FOSS improvements, use of such tools is an appropriate strategic compromise. So if you have to use proprietary tools to advance FOSS, then you should. Number 12, those with skills and interests in making FOSS friendlier to using AI systems should do so on a matter of high priority. Do not overuse large language model generative AI or allow your skills to atrophy. And this is just like, make sure that you actually work through the motions of programming and keep up your skills. And then think carefully about your usage, number 14. So don't run to generative AI immediately for every problem, and pay attention to the large language model generative AI when it is clearly doing useless processing, and quickly redirect it to do something more useful. So that's a very lengthy introduction to that set of ideas. I think this interaction with FOSS is interesting because there's so many issues, I think, that are there, especially from the society, ethics, and tech perspective, that really kind of, we haven't even touched on. Okay, so the first piece, Jesse says, the first piece was from 2022. I missed when the recent one was from 2025, and I think it was very recent. Yeah, it was like at least 2025. So, again, the recommendations come after the sort of the initial article where they kind of state their sort of concerns or misgivings about Copilot, and then they set out these recommendations.
Yeah, so I had this thing like, did the paper talk about that we should let copyrighted software to be used openly because it would benefit the society more? Was that the point?
Well, I think there's this interaction between copyright and copyleft. So first of all, when you use generative AI models, there's a risk of having copyrighted materials in the generated code, and then you contribute it to a copyleft environment where you have a copyleft license governing the project, but then you have copyrighted code in there. And I guess like from a legal standpoint, you could be sued, an organization could be sued for that if that were the case. The other thing though is that for software, in terms of software, the idea that they're presenting is that we don't, and then again, they're FOSS advocates. So they're advocates for open source, using open source software. The only time you should use, in this case, copyright software, proprietary software, is when you absolutely need to. If there's a tool that you absolutely need to use. Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
So copyleft is basically open source, isn't it?
Yeah, so all open source usually uses a copyleft license. The whole open source productivity model doesn't really lend itself easily to copyright law. So the copyright laws that we have it's sort of at odds with open source. So people develop these copyleft licenses as sort of a response to this and say, we need to have governance.
The MIT license is a copyleft license.
Yes, it is. And, the idea is that it specifically addresses what happens when you fork a repository, say. But it doesn't really talk about AI very much. So this is a thing that is, I think, part at the root of the problem is that those licenses haven't really, at least yet, addressed very explicitly this problem.
Oh, okay, got it.
Yeah. It's like Jesse is, I'm going to say something.
Nothing super direct, but it's just many questions about, no questions, but it's a really interesting space because some people in data and direction are really interested in sort of the both evolution and then where it's very interesting to see these like I think in the last article there was this thing where our group spend hours and hours and hours debating how to use LLMs and things like that. And even the first article, I think I was trying to get in the comments, I asked about the dates of the two articles. The first one was from 2022, I think.
Yeah.
And the second one was like in the last year or so, it seems.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting because even though before I joined Orthogonal Lab properly is when Microsoft bought GitHub, but it was sort of hearing it like, oh, Microsoft's GitHub was like, oh yeah, like that happened around then. So just this evolution of big companies acquiring like GitHub or acquiring publishing houses and all of these sort of preemptive moves to deal with the other side of the coin of this, and I kind of missed if this was talked about explicitly, is the moves that the people making the LLMs are doing to try to protect themselves from impending copyright stuff. And there's already certain pushback about it. There's already some forms of legal action taking place, and I think it's really challenging. I'm literally off multiple times in the last 3 days. I've had conversations with people that are designing prototypes, and they're wrestling with software prototypes, wrestling with LLM use, and both from like a personal moral sense, and then also some of these legal implications, some of the issues, maybe not directly stated, but very much alluded to: copyright, copyleft, mixing. How do you deal with things that aren't even if you're collaborating with a group of people about stuff that you've been working on over the course of many years in the past, and you're using, like, that's being fed into some generative stuff that isn't even properly in one of the copyright or copyleft camps yet at all, and how does that merge into whatever the output is, and how do you designate that? It's a very complicated situation, and even the last paper that we read for Cognition Futures, the philosophical transaction A, there's a nice AI disclaimer on the bottom, and it was like, the AI may have helped with our initial drafting, but we've done this part, or we've done this part, and the authors agree that we've signed off on. We're endorsing everything we've put out here. So it's like these new ways to just trying to even say, hey, we've done, we have acknowledged using an LLM, but we're trying to model disclosure, which is a challenging thing to do, even in Royal Society A. Like which is a challenging thing to do in the conventions aren't really fully established yet. So I'm really glad to see. I might point some folks out to look at what Bradley covered today, because I think it's a nice background of FOSS, that's free open source software, open source, copyright, copyleft. Like, those are the contemporary landscape. There's a lot of things happening in. So it's definitely good to kind of, even though it's a murky landscape, get your bearings in it. And this is a good start to that.
Yeah, I think it's, and this is something that I kind of raise in my project management course. I have a little section that I'm constantly revising about what happens when you work with a technology that isn't worked out fully yet. And the example I use, of course, is generative AI. Back before this example, not too far back, but of course with some of the image generation software, where you would train your model on images, and then you'd produce images that were derivatives of things maybe that were famous images or copyrighted images or whatever. And then, of course, you have this issue of remixing, but you have it at a level that is like you're generating something new. And the existing copyright law, by the way, about like, what's a copyrighted image? It's like, okay, if you modify it slightly, then it's yours. That's the rule that basically everyone's been following up until recently. And so, okay, if it's a generative image and it's modified from the original, then okay, it's like making something in Photoshop and distorting it or doing a reproduction. So, but then there are other technical issues of like licensing something like that. Like if I have a model and I have it where I have like a standard copyleft model of for my organization. So it's a copyleft license. And I say, okay, you can fork this and use it as you want. Who owns the products that are produced by the software? I mean, there are people who have use generative image software to create images that then they sell for a lot of money. Does that belong to the community, or does that belong to the original authors of the software, or does that belong to no one? Should it not be used in a commercial way? It's hard
Yeah.
to say. So there are all these intersecting issues, and there are licenses for specific to generative image AI. They have developed licenses for that, and so they address some of these issues very specifically. But again, you're always going to have these gray areas that crop up.
Yeah. I think anytime this conversation comes up, I think about for like a year, I think it's kind of died down, but everybody, when it kind of really hit mainstream, everybody did the Ghiblification, Studio Ghibli of their profile pictures and stuff like that. And I want to write, I have a draft somewhere, but I want to write something about that where it's like the immense irony, like if it was like Pixar, if it was like Toy Storyfication, it would be very
Yeah.
different. But like if you know, I want to share his name right, Miyazaki, the main driving force behind Studio Ghibli, and his reaction to seeing like AI stuff and how he meticulously handcrafted all like Ghibli films are like intentionally not using technology in the ways
Yeah.
that some other things do. And so it's just this like very deep, like really kind of dark humor that I think most people don't like. Oh, I'm all cute like now, and it's like there's this massive. It's such an interesting like artistic reference point of a lot of what this technical policy detail is coming out. Bradley mentioned who gets money for it, and also the flip side of the coin, who gets when something goes wrong, who do people point at? Gets sued, and particularly, I was talking about a book. We're kind of talking about potentially, and I actually offer it here too. It could be a joint thing between Data and Direction and Google Summer Code, open source, whatever. We're talking about making a summer reading list in the way that a lot of like Cosmos Institute and many of these like oriented think tank groups or whatever have their whatever. And so we were talking about that, and we talked about Empire of AI, which is this Karen Hough thing, and a deep expose of some stuff. And one of the things that came up, I was actually in a bookstore, I saw it on the shelf again today, was and crapification for a PG audience. And I've said worse here, but just for the sake of today, basically how the internet became crappy and why. And that's sort of potentially on the list as well in terms of what's interesting was, and I haven't read the book fully, but it came up and it's something we're prospecting for a potential reading list. But to the point of our conversation is, I want to pull up the thing about it here. This is a very brief summary of it. How and it's under the category in our reading list of how direction drifts even when the technology stays put. And so Cory Doctor's book and crapification, the life cycle, platforms are good to users to lock them in and then abuse users to please business customers and then claw value back for everyone for shareholders, and then they die. It's like this cycle of like, it's kind of potentially extractive in that sense, but his real argument is that it isn't just a natural decay. It's what happens when disciplining forces like competition, regulation, interruptibility, and the power of workers are removed. So it gets to like for what we were looking at, the same data, the same technology, but different directions depending on who's making it work in different ways. And what I would say here is like when the conversation I had hours ago with someone doing the prototype work was basically they're looking at their internal dismay, if you will, or wrestling with the fact that I use a technology to make this thing, and I feel okay about that, maybe or maybe not. But I'm contributing to this immense downward pressure on uh, the urge to get things out so fast and fix it later as a actual, like, the nature of competition, like the disciplining forces, as mentioned here, competition, regulation, interoperability, worker power. Like the nature of the competition itself changes kind of the essential. I don't even know who said this first. I think Norbert Wiener mentioned a version of it in his book, but I know he didn't say it. Like basically, competition against slavery is when you're competing with slave-produced labor, you're competing with slavery. Various versions of that quote across time of when the production itself is a certain way. Like if you're going to be in that market and earnestly compete with it, you have to get to a same level of even take away the morality of it, the same level of rushedness or whatever. So it's sort of this, how do I participate? I think it's a major question for a lot of people trying to develop meaningful technology right now. And it's really weird when you get into pitching and startups and I have to present this in a certain way to the funding, like the potential funding and development of a organization that's developing a product. That's it's whole other kind of approach to that. But even just a general solo or small collective group of creators that are trying to make a potential product, it's like, how do you're forced to contend with these choices in ways that I think are very, very unique to the moment that we're in. So I will pause there, and I'm sure other people have things to say. And also, I think Kavya joined, so I don't know if you have any.
I'm sorry, I was late this time. I was actually last week as well as today. I was actually busy with some college work and some committee work
That's
as
fine.
well. I could not do much regarding the developmental work, but yeah, I did found one paper that was quite recent, like around 2025. It was the work by the same author that had proposed, I think, the neuromorphic agents, like to, in order to have true intelligence, you need active inference and neurodevelopment. Yeah, so I did found one paper which is somewhat close to what I was doing. Like in that paper, they had transferring priors from child to adult, like how priors are transferred from one stage to another. So I will share that. Share that paper if you want.
All right.
Like
Yeah.
Put in the Slack or the Discord. So
which would be better? I can send anywhere.
Both. Just we have.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds great. Yeah, I mean, we need to be able to do, sort of a review of the stuff that's coming out. People are always looking at different ways of representing this, and so
Yeah, there was this one author. I mean, I think some of the authors are, they propose something back, then they work on the limitations and propose another paper. Yeah, so this was something I found. So I mean, it's a little bit close to what I was doing, but yeah, I'll have to look more closely so I can work on the gaps. Like, what can I do? Yeah, so yeah, I'll have to read it more closely.
Yeah, this is going to be kind of interesting because there have been people kind of proposing different methods, and even just kind of a review of those would be an interesting exercise. But I mean, I know if you want to implement something, it's kind of difficult to go through all of the different ways of doing it. But it might actually be worth kind of going over some of the papers and finding the things that are that they have in common, and then focusing on those things. So what are people kind of converging on with some of these methods? Are they converging on, like, what about maybe, like, learning or some aspect of what is it that what is it about development that really works in all those papers. And I don't know what the answer is. I know that active inference is one part of it. There's also this idea of teaching from parent to child, or from things like tutor learning and things like that. So that's kind of maybe the next step is to go through several of those papers and kind of find the things that they have in common, and then say, what is this kernel of what makes all these methods kind of work, I guess.
Yeah. Oh, Morgan, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I highly recommend Logan Cross's Theory of Mind for Agents papers. Unfortunately, he's no longer continues that research because he got hired by DeepMind.
Oh, yeah.
But, I mean, hopefully he's still working on it. But, yeah, but it's like you can find his GitHub bio page, and yeah, I still think that his is perhaps the work that's the most active inference. But would love to hear about other papers. Yeah.
So what's his name again?
Logan Cross.
Logan Cross, yeah. So he was at Stanford. I forget what his GitHub bio is. It's like, it's like, L Cross 93 or something like that. GitHub io. like whatever his username is on GitHub.
Yeah. Right. Kavya posted in the chat a Marr-Inspired framework for raising good robots. Yeah. Actually, the link says a multi-dimensional approach. Let's see what this looks like. Yeah, this is the yeah, it says a multi-dimensional approach, but it's Marr-Inspired framework. So this is Sarah Hamburg. Okay, so she does a lot of things with active inference and robots. So that is a nice paper. And so this is, I guess, a technical paper. No, it's a IEEE Transactions on Cognitive and Developmental Systems. So this is a IEEE journal, and that's kind of what they're getting at here in the article. So yeah, she has a lot of interesting work on developmental robotics, thinking about energy efficiency and pro-social values.
Not being shared.
Oh. Let's see. Okay. Yeah. So so this is the paper, Marr-Inspired framework for raising good robots. And so when she says good robots, or when the authors say good robots, having pro-social values, having transparent behaviors, meaning that you can explain how the behaviors are generated, being energy efficient, and then linking that to Marr's 3 levels, and which we've talked about in the Saturday meetings, being the implementation level, the algorithmic level, and the computational level. So the implementation level is neuromorphic hardware, the algorithmic level is active inference, and the computational level are these pro-social goals. And then that's how they approach this, and they come out with sort of some points here. This is the conceptual diagram, and these things sort of develop over time. So through development, you go from the implementation level to the algorithmic level, and then the computational level is, I guess, somewhere in between. Yeah, that looks good. Thank you for that, Kavya.
So, I imagine we're basically wrapping up right now.
Yeah.
I would really like for, excuse me, it's on my face. I would really like for Morgan Kavya, myself, and at least Alicea from Data and Direction, and maybe one other person, and probably Avery, to be honest, to have a meeting at some point in the next near future, because we're all circling some things, and I think there's sort of basically just multi-agent stuff. And what's really cool is the cross theory of mind stuff I totally forgot about that might be relevant for Alicia's stuff. Alicia is one of the data and direction interns. We're working on multi-agent stuff. And then the one also about raising good robots is also very interesting. So there's not enough time to get into things properly, but I don't know if I could get Alicea to come to this meeting sometime. I know she's got her schedule's changing up a lot, but maybe I can try to get her to come here, or like if we could meet maybe one time in the next week or two, we could have either a before or after this meeting for a little bit, or part of this meeting could be about it, because yeah, maybe Saturdays also, but I'm less sure what would work. But just because I feel like there's a nexus here, and I feel like I can see it. It's like, okay, guys, we gotta have a huddle about this, even if we work on different things, because cool stuff is happening. So
Yeah.
to be continued on that front.
Say again, though, what was the focus? Sorry, I had to step out for a second.
A number of basically people doing a lot of multi-agent stuff. Kavya's doing this, and one of the data and direction interns, Alicea, is doing a lot of something very similar. So I think we should all get together and talk specifically about it, basically.
Yeah, no, that would be great. I mean, I have absolutely continued, the both sustain hub kinds of projects. I mean, both a multi-agent reinforcement learning and a LLM agent focus. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's probably it for today. Anything else you wanted to say, Bradley, before we go?
No, I just wanted to mention that, like, the conversation Jesse, like the comments Jesse had in our conversation, those were pretty good. I think going in that direction of looking at how, in this idea of project decay or enshittification, as you like to, it's it's all thinking about it in terms of FOSS is really interesting, because that we don't talk about that too much, but a lot of this angst that you saw in the original article was about that. It was about how do we maintain the integrity of FOSS projects or of open source projects with these challenges. And I think, if we can solve those, or at least make sure that the projects don't degrade because of, voluminous contributions or poor contributions or licensing violations, then the better off we are. So, yeah, that's a very good conversation to follow up on.
Yeah, and we can maybe do that next week.
Yeah.
But no, that's all I had to say. So it's good stuff today, and thanks everybody for stopping by.
Yeah, thank you. See you next week.